right? Thanking and praising God for the wisdom in his repetition, something that we thank him for from time to time. Let's call John chapter 4 truth, understanding that not long ago we got a look at truth in the perspective or from the perspective of the Gospels. John, the very last gospel, will give us yet another chance to look at truth, something that Jesus, is going to refer to 3 times in the famous story of the woman at the well, a story that starts off in the first 6 verses, saying that Jesus, as his baptism or the ministry, portion of his ministry devoted to baptism, as it is growing, it attracts the attention of the Pharisees, prompting him to keep it moving from Judea to Galilee, causing him to go through Samaria, setting the stage for his interaction with the woman at the well. Verse 7 going on to help us understand that the introduction is set up by a simple, it would be a request, but it's stated in the imperative or just as a statement that she is going to rephrase into a question, quite possibly correcting his phrasing, as he's going to say, give me a drink, as she has something to draw water with, as opposed to Christ, who apparently doesn't. However, there is more, of course, than meets the eye to the Christ and his seat at a well without a bucket, as he is going to tell her that even though he might have, and this is my paraphrase, sounded terse or direct in simply stating, give me a drink, he realized, or she would realize, that if she would ask him, the water that he is asking for is nothing in comparison to the water that he can provide. However, she does not seem immediately convinced because you can't tell necessarily from the written dialogue, but she is going to seem to have either a jovial tone or a slightly perturbed tone, or maybe even a little bit of sarcasm in the initial interchange going from verses 7 through 15. However, he is going to cut through any sarcasm that might be in her tone with a prophecy that is going to tell her not only her current living situation with the man who is not her husband, but her previous divorces are going to be things that he has insight into that she is going to realize he could not have insight into them unless he was a prophet. And of course, he is not only a prophet, he is more than that, as she is soon going to realize. But that is going to be in the course of verses 16 through 26, where her tone is going to change. And not only is her tone going to change, she is going to begin to cut through some of the resentment that she has identified exists between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. Her being a Samaritan, she is set aback or taken aback by the fact that Jesus would ask her for anything in the first place. And now he is going to help her to understand that he is coming with a message that cuts through those lines of division, understanding that she is going to talk about the tension, or at least one of the points of contention between Samaria and the Jewish people is where the proper place of worship is, at which point he is going to help her to understand that God is ushering in an age where he doesn't care about where you worship as much as he cares about the integrity with which you worship. Setting off in verses 23 and 24, the famous statement, but the hour is coming and now is here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. 3 times helping us understand why we thought truth might be a good topic for this relatively famous story, as we are then going to see a further shift in her perspective, quite possibly including a shift in her priorities, as verses 27 through 30 see her leaving the well, going back home to report to the people, having left behind her water pot, essentially disregarding the purpose she originally went to the well for, understanding that something greater is here, as she is going to raise the question, could this possibly be the Messiah? Probably initially because of the prophecy, but beyond the prophecy, because of the wisdom that he has used in cutting to the heart of the issue. Not only the issues in her life, her marital situation, but possibly offering her some answers that can cut even more deeply beneath the lingering resentment between the 2 rival factions in that day. Once again, the people of Israel and the people of Samaria. Not only is this going to give us an opportunity to see the shift in her priorities, it's going to give Jesus' apostles to see his priorities more clearly as they return offering him something to eat in verses 31 through 38, at which point he is going to help them to understand that he already has food they understand nothing about. His food is to do the will of his Father. And now that he has opened a door for God to be reconciled with even the Samaritans, God or Jesus seems quite content with being able to find joy in the sustenance that he finds, in the peace that may now be possible in a place where there was once resentment. However, verses 39 through 42 are going to go on to show that Christ, when he comes into contact with the people of her village in Samaria, they are going to ask him to stay, and he's going to seem to be happy to stay because he is going to stay for a couple of days before moving back on towards Galilee, understanding that they are going to say, even above her word, which they seem to have found persuasive, thus they asked him to stay, they now believe because of their time, the time they were able to spend with the Christ. As verses 43 through 45 are going to show him moving back towards Galilee, and in spite of what we've seen in previous Gospels about him not having honor in his own hometown, as they're going to reference here, that was specifically the rejection that he found at Nazareth. Because of the great things he did in Jerusalem, word got back to Galilee, so there were at least some portions of Galilee, there were some portions of Galilee where at least he was received well, even though it was a mixed blessing, because it seems that their reception was too heavily rooted in the magic, or not the magic, that's a bad term for it, too heavily rooted in the miracles that he could do, because magic carries a darker connotation of the witchcraft that was prohibited in the Old Covenant. And there's a distinction between the true stunning things that can be done through magic and the higher level of work that can be done through miracles that can be only done through the power of God. And so because of the miracles that they saw, they are receptive to him in Galilee, but the next story, the final story of the chapter, is going to show the limits of the receptiveness back home, even in the places where they received him well, as verses 46 through the end of the chapter, 54, are going to describe the way that an official whose son was ill is going to come to Jesus, prompting him to say in verse 48, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe, helping them to understand that even in the place where the people were supposed to be devoted to God, they were supposed to be better than the Samaritans, they got comfortable to the point where their hearts were not as receptive to the truth that God had for them as people who were allegedly less holy. Reminding me, for whatever reason, of a modern application of this story, and that is the way in which even in the church today, it seems that far too often I see those who have found something more appealing than truth, and that is power. Leaving far too many who claim to be the people of God silent as truth suffers decline as long as things are going well for them. Far too often leaving those who are willing to speak truth only speaking that fraction of it that feels safe. A temptation that, as I mentioned before, I appreciate, as it's clearly growing more and more difficult to speak the whole truth. Leaving Christ's true disciples a difficult dilemma, and that is the less welcomed that truth, the actual truth, becomes here, the more tempted we can become to accept versions of the truth that make us unwelcomed with God. Over time, as Luke chapter 14 reminded us, leaving us with a character that God might describe as bland, giving us the illustration of salt that has lost its flavor, potentially leaving us with the desire to worship God. But as John chapter 4 reminds us, it may be a desire to worship God that lacks the truth, or maybe even better stated, genuine integrity that God is actually seeking. Which, quite simply, is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please restore in us and nurture in us the commitment to not only worship you in spirit and in truth, but likewise the commitment to neither grieve your Holy Spirit nor diminish the truth.